The teeth in George Washington's mouth didn't come from trees, they came from the mouths of enslaved people. We all know the myth of the boy who couldn't tell a lie about a cherry tree, the flawless general who single-handedly birthed a superpower, and the stoic marble statue of a man on the dollar bill. But history is rarely written in marble. It is written in blood, sweat, and secrets. In school, they taught you the hero, but they conveniently left out the man who was America's biggest whiskey tycoon, the man who survived enough near-death experiences to make you wonder if he was actually immortal, and the man who spent his final years in a desperate, secret cat-and-mouse game to hunt down a runaway teenager who dared to escape his estate. Forget the textbooks, because the real, unfiltered truth is far darker, weirder, and more complex than any classroom lecture ever dared to reveal. The most famous myth of all is that of Washington's wooden teeth. Almost every American schoolchild has been told this comfortable lie, but wood is porous. It would have rotted, splintered, and tasted terrible within days. The reality is far gruesome and far more revealing of the era he lived in. By the time Washington became president in 1789, he had exactly one natural tooth left in his mouth. He suffered from agonizing dental issues his entire adult life, likely exacerbated by mercury-based medications used to treat his illnesses. To fix this, he wore heavy, painful dentures made from a terrifying cocktail of materials: carved hippopotamus ivory, elephant tusks, gold wire, lead brass screws, and human teeth. His personal accounts and ledgers from Mount Vernon reveal a dark truth about where those human teeth came from. In May 1784, Washington paid several unnamed enslaved workers on his plantation a small sum of money, roughly 1/3 of the market value, to have their teeth extracted so they could be implanted into his dentures. While some historians argue this was voluntary, the extreme power dynamic between an enslaved person and their master makes the word voluntary highly questionable. Every time Washington spoke, smiled, or signed a treaty, he did so behind the teeth of the people he legally owned, a stark physical reminder of the deeply uncomfortable contradiction at the very foundation of America. When we think of Washington's retirement, we picture him sitting quietly on his porch at Mount Vernon. But Washington wasn't built for quiet, and in his final years, he became one of the most aggressive, cutthroat businessmen in the early United States. His product of choice was whiskey. In 1797, fresh out of the presidency, Washington was persuaded by his farm manager, a Scotsman named James Anderson, to build a commercial distillery. Washington didn't just build a small copper still, he built an industrial powerhouse featuring 5 copper stills operating around the clock, producing over 11,000 gallons of rye whiskey a year. This operation made George Washington's estate one of the largest commercial whiskey producers in the entire country. He made a massive fortune selling cheap, unaged whiskey to local merchants and tavern owners. But there is a profound irony in this success. Just a few years prior, as president, Washington literally marched an army of 13,000 militia troops to crush the Whiskey Rebellion, a tax revolt by independent distillers. Apparently, fighting against whiskey taxes was treason, but cornering the whiskey market was just good American business. Before he was a political icon, Washington was a British colonial officer, and if you look at his military career, it is hard not to wonder if the man was protected by some kind of supernatural luck.
Long before the Revolutionary War, during the French and Indian War, a young Washington found himself trapped in the Battle of the Monongahela in 1755. It was an absolute slaughter. The British forces were ambushed, panic-stricken, and cut to pieces as British officers were systematically targeted by Native American and French marksmen. Out of 86 British officers, 63 were killed or wounded. Washington was right in the thick of it, having 2 horses shot out under him. When the smoke finally cleared, Washington walked away without a single scratch. But when he took off his gold-trimmed blue coat, he discovered 4 distinct bullet holes tearing through his clothing. Bullets had passed inches from his chest and ribs, yet none broke his skin. Later in life, he survived smallpox, dysentery, malaria, tuberculosis, and anthrax. During the Revolutionary War, British marksmen had him in their crosshairs multiple times, but hesitated to shoot an officer in the back. He was a man who, by all laws of probability, should have died a dozen times over before ever reaching the presidency, convincing many of his contemporaries and Washington himself that he was literally chosen by divine providence to lead. He is universally called the father of his country, but one of the most poignant, personal tragedies of Washington's life is that he was never able to become a father to a child of his own. When he married the wealthy widow Martha Dandridge Custis, he became a loving, dedicated stepfather to her two surviving children, John and Patsy. But despite decades of marriage, George and Martha never had biological children together, leaving historians to whisper about why for centuries. Modern medical historians believe the answer lies in Washington's youth. At age 19, during a trip to Barbados, Washington contracted smallpox. While he recovered, the virus may have left him sterile. Another strong suspect is tuberculosis, which he contracted twice, as both diseases are known to cause male infertility under certain conditions. But while this was undoubtedly a private sorrow, it may have been a political blessing. At the end of the Revolutionary War, many Americans wanted to make Washington a king. If Washington had possessed a biological son, the temptation to establish a hereditary royal dynasty in America would have been immense. By having no heirs of his blood, Washington was uniquely positioned to step down from power, ensuring that the father of the nation left his legacy to the citizens, not to a prince. Perhaps the most heavily guarded secret of Washington's life, one the textbooks completely ignore, is his complicated, often ruthless relationship with slavery. Washington's views on slavery evolved over his life. By his final years, he privately expressed a desire to see the institution abolished, and he was the only slave-owning founding father to order all his enslaved workers freed in his will. But his public principles often clashed violently with his private desires, and nowhere is this clearer than in the story of Ona Judge. Ona Judge was Martha Washington's personal maid. She was highly skilled, treated relatively well by the standards of the day, and lived with the Washingtons in the temporary capital of Philadelphia. But Pennsylvania had a law stating that any enslaved person brought into the state who stayed for longer than 6 consecutive months was automatically freed. To bypass this law, Washington systematically rotated his enslaved staff back to Virginia every 5 months and 29 days, resetting the clock. He hid this maneuver from the public, writing privately to his aides to keep the rotations quiet so as not to draw backlash from abolitionists. In 1796, realizing she was about to be given away as a wedding present to Martha's granddaughter, 22-year-old Ona Judge, 22-year-old Ona Judge made a daring escape, slipping out of the house while the Washingtons were eating dinner and boarding a ship to New Hampshire.
When Washington found out, he was furious. He didn't just let her go. For 3 years, utilizing the full power of the presidency and federal agents, Washington relentlessly hunted Ona. He sent customs officials to kidnap her, but Ona was warned by local free black communities and escaped into hiding. Washington even tried to negotiate, offering her freedom if she returned, but only after he and Martha died. Ona refused, stating she wanted her freedom immediately. Even on his deathbed, Washington was still writing letters trying to capture her. Ona Judge lived out the rest of her life in New Hampshire as a fugitive, but she died a free woman, revealing a very human, deeply flawed Washington who was torn between his intellectual belief in freedom and his stubborn aristocratic pride. If you look at any portrait of Washington, he looks completely devoid of emotion, stoic, calm, and almost unshakable. But this composure was a mask. In reality, Washington possessed a terrifying, explosive temper. His contemporaries wrote about how his face would turn purple with rage when crossed. He was incredibly demanding of his staff, his officers, and his horses. During the Battle of Monmouth, when General Charles Lee ordered a chaotic retreat, Washington rode up to him and unleashed a stream of furious, profanity-laced rage that witnesses said literally shook the leaves on the trees. Thomas Jefferson later wrote that Washington's temper was naturally irritable, and that when it broke, his temper was most tremendous. The reason Washington appeared so calm in public was not because he didn't feel anger, but because he spent his entire life in a brutal, daily mental battle to control it. His legendary self-control wasn't natural. It was a hard-fought weapon of sheer will. Why does this matter? Why do we need to know about the teeth, the whiskey, the temper, and the flaws? Because when we turn our historical figures into flawless gods, we make them impossible to emulate, and we make their achievements seem easy. The real George Washington was not a marble statue. He was a deeply complicated man of his time, ruthless in business, physically lucky, personally plagued by tragedy, and profoundly compromised by the system of slavery. But he was also a man who possessed the sheer willpower to hold a fragile, collapsing nation together when no one else could. By understanding his darkness, his light shines in a way that is far more real.